Well, we're talking inflation today. We saw some new inflation numbers out, a big dip under 2%. A lot of people talking about the effects of the carbon tax, more importantly, its removal. Is this what's causing a big dip in inflation? Will this trend continue? To help get us some answers, a real pleasure to welcome back onto the program Trevor Tombe. He's an economist at the University of Calgary and a research fellow at their School of Public Policy. Trevor, great to be in conversation with you.
Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's dig right in here. We saw this dip in inflation. Many people obviously attaching that to the Carney government's decision to drop the carbon tax. Just how important is the carbon tax to this most recent inflation reading?
So, the removal of the carbon tax is the only reason why inflation, or at least that headline rate of the average change in consumer prices, dropped in April relative to the month before. So, we had 1.7% in April. That represents the increase in consumer prices that month compared to 1 year earlier. Whereas in March, the reading was 2.3%. Now, had it not been for the carbon tax removal, I estimate that the April reading would have been indeed 2.3%, so
Okay.
no change. So the entire drop is really just because of that policy change.
Now, Trevor, should I get excited that this is going to continue and inflation? Well, I don't want it to go too low. We don't want deflation. But is this a trend that will continue? Is this a trend that's my friend?
Well, it's okay to be excited, especially if you purchase gasoline, home heating, fuel, things like that. So the carbon tax removal absolutely made those items cheaper, no question, about on average 18 cents a liter or so on gasoline, for example. But this effect that it has on what Statistics Canada measures the headline rate of inflation to be, this is a one-time change. This represents a policy change that will only affect the calculation from Statistics Canada for the next 12 months. And the reason for that is April, May, June of this year, we'll be comparing it to April, May, June, and so on of last year when the
Ah,
carbon tax was
right.
in place. But once we get to April of next year, then we'll be comparing an
Got it.
April that doesn't have a carbon tax to this year's April, which also doesn't have a carbon tax. So what we would see is a temporary 12-month drop in what we measure this year-over-year change to be. And we've seen this before when the GST was first introduced in the early 1990s. It made the rate of headline inflation look higher than it really was for at least that 12-month period. When tobacco taxes were dramatically cut in the mid 1990s, we saw the reverse with overall consumer prices basically zero for 12 months, when really price changes were typically much higher than that when you exclude the effect of the policy change. So this is not new. And Statistics Canada does, and the Bank of Canada does, look at a different data series than this headline inflation rate. They strip out the effect of these indirect taxes to have a better read of what the actual underlying inflation pressures are when you exclude these policy changes.
Yeah, well, let's call up onto the screen now a graph that was in your helpful article in the Hub, the effect of indirect taxes on consumer price inflation rates. And there you can see, Trevor, not only this year is the elimination of the carbon tax a story, but the GST holiday that we saw around the Christmas period. Explain to
That's right.
what we're seeing in this graph, especially the divergence of the lines at the very end.
That's right. So this is comparing the headline rate of inflation that we all kind of get reported to us each month from Statistics Canada. That's the blue line. I'm sorry, that's the red line. In blue is a different data series that strips out the effect of what are called indirect taxes. And these are all taxes that we don't pay directly as individuals, but they're embedded in the items that we buy. So think about excise taxes on cigarettes or sales taxes like the GST or gas taxes or carbon taxes. And so if you squint at that graph, or if you check out the article at thehub.ca, you see there is typically a higher red line, a higher red line than the blue line, which
Hmm.
strips out the effect of those tax changes. That's mostly the carbon tax. And so over the past 6 years or so, the carbon tax, because it ratchets up each April, added about 0.1% to that headline rate of inflation. And when these taxes change, sometimes in a big way, we can more visibly see the effect. So the GST holiday was pretty big. I mean, love it or hate it, it was a big change that you can see showing up as a lower rate of inflation that we measure just because we've eliminated the sales tax on a bunch of items. Whereas in the most recent reading, right at the end of the graph, you see that the inflation rate, that red line, takes a
Yeah.
sharp drop, about 0.6% below what it would otherwise have been. And that's because of the carbon tax removal.
It's interesting the shading in that line of how you say the red line just bumping up over the blue over the last 6 years, but in a very small way. So Trevor, if we go back and we really think of the last 6 years, the cumulative effects of the carbon tax really not that significant. Is that right? If we're thinking of the extent to which, at least in terms of political debates, it was really singled out as a big cost driver in people's lives. It was singled out by the Conservatives as a major factor in the so-called affordability crisis in Canada. But your research and what I'm seeing in that graph would suggest that maybe those claims were a bit outsized.
Yeah, and so I just want to be clear up front. It's completely fair to support or oppose the carbon tax for any number of reasons. But when we think about inflation in June of 2022, it peaked at 8.1%, a higher level than we've seen in decades and a sharper increase than we've seen since the 1950s. And so I think the attention on affordability issues was very well placed. But the carbon tax added only about 0.1% to that. So a very small fraction of the total. So all sorts of other factors were what were driving inflation in Canada over the past several years. Global energy prices being high, fertilizer prices, especially following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, being high, adding to, with a slight lag, food prices at the grocery store. Of course, the housing challenges, which are just wild in Canada, especially in some major cities, a big driver as well. And so policy did add, measurably to that change, but just a small fraction of the total. Now, the reason why we're seeing a 0.6% drop at the end when the carbon tax is removed, whereas previously we only saw this small zero
Yeah,
point 0.1 or so incremental contribution, is because the 0.6%
it was a
drop that
cumulative.
we've just seen, that represents the removal of all of the
Yes.
accumulated zero point 0.1 and then another zero point 0.1 and
Right.
then another for 6 years accumulates to
Yeah.
this larger amount.
Yeah. This is fascinating, Trevor. Thank you for this conversation. I guess I just want to end on what we've lost and what we've gained with the carbon tax. I mean, again, you're right. All kinds of debates we can have about the carbon tax, its effects on all kinds of different variables in parts of our economy. But it was a strategy to try to use, price signals to change behavior and to divert parts of our economy in ways that would hopefully lead to carbon mitigation over time. We've now lost that tool. We still have the climate change. We still have the climate change challenge. That's a bit of a tongue twister. It's We're going to have to deal with it. The Carney government's talking about continuing with a tax on large emitters. I don't know. I step back from all this and think, Trevor, maybe that we took a tool out of the toolbox, and I don't know, maybe we'll look back on this and think it's better to have more tools in your toolbox than less when you're dealing with a big challenge like climate.
It's also important to remember that all tools have different costs and benefits associated with them. The merit of the carbon tax is it doesn't require the government choose where emissions
Yes.
reductions occur. It creates this incentive, and then businesses and individuals try and think about the cheapest ways of lowering emissions. And of course, it's a visible cost, and it also lands on many who don't have low cost opportunities to avoid burning
Right.
fossil fuels or emitting. And so there's certainly some trade-offs there for sure. But without that tool, the government, both federally and governments provincially, will need to rely on other tools, mainly regulations or subsidies, which are ultimately financed through, say, taxes on income or consumption to try and lower emissions. And that, I think, opens us up to a lot of, well, potentially interesting conversations, but also scope for some regional tension.
Yeah.
I've written for the Hub about the emissions cap, for example, on oil and gas. This is an example of a regulatory approach that chooses a particular sector for more emissions reductions at higher cost than could be done elsewhere in the economy. And that not only lowers productivity and GDP and employment and incomes, but also inflames some of these tensions between certain parts of the country and the federal government, tensions that I think we're seeing mount in Alberta right now. And I think that's potentially risky. So I do hope that if we are to approach things through a regulatory, through a bunch of regulatory policies, as seems likely, that we do so flexibly, as flexibly as possible, to try not to incur too much more costs, both economically and politically, than we need to.
Yeah, fairness has got to be part of this, and that extends to Canada's regions. So let's see how this plays out. Trevor Tombe, thank you for the another great article on the Hub. Such clear thinking, clear analysis, and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was Trevor Tombe, economist at the University of Calgary. You can check out Trevor's latest article for us at www.thehub.ca. If you're enjoying these videos, please click on the subscribe button. You can also dingle that little notification bell and you'll get all of our latest videos sent to you as soon as they're published. If you're listening to this over on our podcast feed, please write a review. Always appreciate your feedback and comments. Thanks again for listening to Hub Hits. We'll get back to you next time with our best content. Until then, bye-bye.